You're listening to another episode of the Range Gareth podcast, where we discuss nature news, hot topics in the ecosphere, and interview some of the finest environmental minds. I'm Gareth, former park ranger and permanent conservationist. Today, my guest is Anessa with YEG Honeycomb, the founder of YEG Honeycomb, and I will let her explain what they do because it is a lot. We're going to discuss a couple different topics about beekeeping, about hives in the city, and about some of the issues that are facing bees in Edmonton. I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my current job. It is, however, my passion to spread awareness about environmental news and events to the general public. I would also like to thank our sponsors. They still don't exist, but I am always ready for your money. YEG Honeycomb models sustainable beekeeping in Alberta's capital, where beekeepers are more commonly adopting commercial beekeeping practices. The mainstream approach to beekeeping comes with the territory. Alberta is the largest producer of honey in North America. When we focus on honey production, it comes at a cost to the health of honeybees, to native bees, and our ecosystem. YEG Honeycomb demonstrates natural and sustainable beekeeping practices to its urban audience, using the ancient practice as a tool for team building, trust building, and healing. YEG Honeycomb focuses on the healing aspects of beekeeping within mental health and addiction, as well as within the prison population. YEG Honeycomb invites corporate teams to navigate goals through beekeeping that include team building, working through trust issues, and being in the hive to balance mind, body, and spirit. Unique corporate sponsorship opportunities are also available to support this regenerative community initiative. Thanks for coming on, Anessa. So the third Saturday in August is World Honeybee Day, August 17th. And luckily today I am joined by Anessa from YEG Honeycomb. Hi Anessa, thanks for coming on.
It's nice to be here.
So when I told my friends that I was going to be having a discussion with a beekeeping general bee expert, I was flooded with questions on Facebook, in person, through text messages. I sent you a bunch of these beforehand so we could jump right into it. The first question was an easy one. Will beekeepers put hives on someone's property?
That is not an issue. There's a lot of beekeepers who like to use different properties for beekeeping, and they don't need to use their own.
YEG Honeycomb has set up a few hives in the Edmonton area, correct?
Yes, so we've worked with the City of Edmonton to help develop guidelines for commercial beekeeping, and currently some of our hives include some City of Edmonton-owned locations and some locations that help to serve the underserved or vulnerable communities.
What are some locations you have hives?
So some of our locations include City Hall, Chancery Hall, Rossdale Plant, Old Man Creek Nursery, where the city plants their trees to help landscape the city. There might be a few more, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. And we also have hives at Grierson Centre, which is a minimum security prison, as well as Alberta Hospital Edmonton, where we work with the mental health and addiction residents there.
One thing I forgot to ask beforehand, what got you into bees?
That was a childhood passion that I was trying to nurture. When I was younger, I really liked the chunky, fuzzy bumblebees. And then as an adult, when I was a flight attendant, I was in London, England, and I found a takeout cup with a picture of a bee strewn on the cobblestone streets of London. And it got me thinking, what were my childhood interests and how can I try to nurture that now as an adult to try to become maybe who we might forget we are as a child. So thus began the whole journey to figure out what do I need to do beekeeping in the city, and how can I make my time spent more meaningful to serve the community.
Did you come from a farming family, or did you have bees as a kid?
No, I was born and raised in Toronto, and so that cute chunky bumblebee was in my backyard.
I don't know how to say this without sounding slightly less manly, but as a kid I was terrified of bees. I blame it on Spencer in the first grade. I still remember his name. He stepped on a bee, and as children do, and we didn't realize that they could still sting you after they died. I picked it up, and it got me right in the thumb, and then Mrs. Ross, the school secretary, put cold mud on the thumb, and that did help cool it down, but for about a decade after that, I was freaked out by bees. Luckily, later on, my parents had like raspberries on the side of the house, and I grew to like them because they were just chilling on the raspberries, and I could pick the raspberries and not get stung, and got over that eventually.
That is quite an experience, and a lot of people have a fear of bees because of the fact that they are able to sting, although they don't seek out to sting.
Yeah.
Like wasps, they can sting multiple times without dying, but honeybees specifically, they do die once they sting.
Yeah. Bumblebees have smooth stingers, right?
Yes.
They can sting you multiple times if they wanted to.
They'll sting you once and then they die.
Oh no, them
Yeah.
too?
Yeah, honeybees.
But bumblebees could do multiple stings?
I'm not sure.
I was like, luckily I've never gotten stung by them. Bumblebees are chill. They seem like they're pretty chill. They just want to awkwardly fly around, bump into flowers all cutely, and then fly away and don't bother anybody.
They're very friendly.
They're little sweethearts. So you sent me a bunch of answers in advance, which was actually great. One of the questions that we got was, how much space is needed between hive colonies? And it sounds like to prevent the spread of pest and disease, you were saying that a separation of 3 miles between hives is how it normally is in the wild, right?
Yeah, ideally.
That leads us into the whole concept of regenerative beekeeping. I know you're very passionate about regenerative beekeeping. Regenerative farming is kind of having a cultural moment right now. It was even featured on Joe Rogan's podcast, the biggest podcast in the world. How would you explain regenerative beekeeping?
Well, honeybees are not native to North America. So as a result, we do have a responsibility to try to manage them in more of a regenerative way, where we're not just importing bees from different provinces or different countries without considering different ways that we can build local genetics and hygienic qualities in our honeybees in a local area. And when we are managing our honeybees, we want to look at growing them at a rate that matches the rate of growth in the wild as well, so that we're not just bringing in hives from all sorts of different places, and then they're just spreading disease rampantly, which is an issue that is currently occurring in Montreal right now.
What is the disease issue in Montreal right now?
So mites, because they're not native to North America, mites are more of a common threat to honeybees, and they often when they're imported, they're not able to try to manage the mites naturally. Ideally, you want to help the bees or help to facilitate, or you want the bees to be able to try to manage the bees naturally and help them to build a resistance to mites. But unfortunately, they've come to rely on miticides. And in commercial beekeeping, a lot of beekeepers are using miticides in their operation to help keep mites at bay.
Are these the Varroa mites?
Yeah.
Where do they come from? Where are Varroa mites from? Are they a European thing? Are they...
I don't even know.
Well, let's look that up quickly, because I know that we have a lot of issues with other kinds of invasives. Like in Edmonton, I know that, house sparrows are an invasive, European starlings are an invasive. The city has a whole group of people whose whole jobs are just looking for invasive plants. It looks like they are a pest, from Australia, or they were introduced to Australia. You know what? I will get to that later. Luckily, it's World Honeybee Day, and that is kind of a big deal. It sounds like National Honeybee Day was meant to be an awareness day for all the beekeepers and beekeeping clubs and honeybee enthusiasts across the U.S. to celebrate honeybees and recognize their contributions to humans' everyday lives. This actually leads me to kind of a fun segue. Are there any native pollinators or native bee species that can produce honey even close to what these European honeybees are producing?
Well, when we're looking at honeybees as a species, honeybees are really the only bees that can produce honey. And there's a lot of subspecies of honeybees, and European honeybees is one of them, but there are many other subspecies of honeybees that do produce honey. So a bumblebee wouldn't produce honey. Name any other native bees that you might see, they wouldn't produce honey.
Man, that's such a shame. I feel like, without being too greedy and anthropocentric, I feel like if the native bees were producing honey, there'd be much more of a loud voice behind them, save our native honey producers. But as you said, Alberta is the largest honey producer in North America.
Yeah.
And trying to replace an industry like that or even shut down an industry like that would be difficult.
Yeah, pollination is also very critical, and we do have a lot of pollinators that aren't just honeybees. So honeybee is just one pollinator that can help with pollinating crops or our native flora. There's also an alternative to using honeybees, which is leafcutter bees, which, as we were saying, they don't produce honey, but they do serve a purpose in pollination.
That would be good. Where do you buy bees from if you were to set up a hive?
So I don't purchase bees. In my first year or two, I did purchase bees. But as part of a regenerative model in beekeeping, we ultimately want to look at making splits out of our surviving colonies to help build on the local genetics, stronger local genetics. We also allow our bees, when we do the splits, to build their own queen. And we do this by allowing them to build off of the fertilized eggs that they have remaining in the hive, and they'll feed a very unique diet, and they might build a few queen cells, and there might be a few that hatch, and they'll choose which queen ultimately they want to rule their hive.
So a split, is that literally just when a hive kind of divides in half and one goes with one queen and one half goes with the other queen?
Yeah, in nature, that is a naturally occurring behavior that's in nature, which is called a swarm. So when we're doing a split, we're essentially imitating what the honeybees would do in the wild, which is a swarm, which also helps to facilitate a brood break, which also helps to cut back on the number of mites within the hive in a way that's natural and without relying on miticides. So that's just one of the steps that we might include in our management in order to, as part of our integrated pest management. So in nature, what a swarm is about 90% of the bees that can fly will take off with the queen, leaving behind the young nurse bees that can't fly yet with the brood. So when the queen and the bees are leaving the nest, this helps with a brood break because most of the mites are feeding on the brood inside the hive. Occasionally there are mites that might feed on the fat bodies of the bees, but then there's this period where these bees that have left the hive now have to build new foundation. Let's say it's in the hollow of a tree in nature, and they have to consume about 8 pounds of honey just to produce 1 pound of wax. So it's a very slow process for them to build those cells before the queen can begin laying eggs again. And then the hive that's remaining, so the young nurse bees with the brood, they're stuck with, or they're just left with the remaining brood, and there's no queen to be able to continue laying. And a queen can lay about 3,000 eggs a day. So when the queen is left, the brood that's there eventually hatches. They're building a new queen. There's a 2-week period before the queen can emerge, and then another 2 weeks before she mates. So that 1 month also helps to cut back on the mites that breed exponentially within the cells of the brood.
There were two things that, when you were speaking, I wanted to touch on there. The first was, so when you say foundation, can we visualize it almost like the foundation of a house? When you're building a hive, you need to lay down a layer of comb first and then build the rest of the hive around it?
Yeah, so in the wild, it's not necessarily just straight foundation. We as beekeepers tend to try to keep the foundation straight for inspection purposes. Mm-hmm. But in the wild or in the cavity of a tree, they can build all kinds of neat shapes in with their comb, and they ultimately need the comb in order to lay and to backfill it with honey and to cap the honey as well.
The other thing I wanted to touch on, it sounded like you said you could induce a split via dietary changes? Was that? Or no? Maybe I misinterpreted that.
So we wouldn't induce a split. Oh, so that's what I was saying earlier, you mean? Okay.
Yeah, or can you encourage a split by dietary changes?
So no, okay, you don't need to use dietary changes. It's the queen. The formation of a queen gets fed a very specific diet that allows this fertilized egg, which isn't unique from any of the other fertilized egg, to then form as a queen.
The workers feed the queen a special diet.
Yeah.
We as beekeepers would not feed the hive.
We wouldn't feed the hive a special diet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
It's just for the production of queens.
All right. That cleans that up for me mentally. Another thing, which I know we did touch on briefly, but are all domestic bees the same species? So it sounds like there are several different types of honeybees, several different subspecies. Are all of the subspecies farmed, or is it the European honeybees that are shipped all around the world for the purposes of farming?
So I wouldn't refer to them as European honeybees. I'd refer to them as just honeybees, because beekeepers in Edmonton and area, or any beekeeper for that matter, might have different subspecies of honeybees. So I wouldn't say that I use European honeybees, because I try to focus on splits and catching swarms as well to help breed those local genetics. But what was the question again?
Just like, are all domestic bees the same species?
So I wouldn't refer to them as domestic bees either, because they're not domestic or domesticated. I would refer to them more as native versus non-native species. What was the question again?
Are they all the same species?
Are they all the same species? There's different honeybees. There's different subspecies of honeybees.
So like in North America now, we probably have multiple subspecies of the honeybees that are all being used to produce honey in this area. There's not like one standard bee that everyone in Alberta is using.
No. So
it's not like the Holstein cattle that everybody has.
Okay, yeah. So I like to prefer breeding local genetics, but people might import a nucleus colony from, let's say, somewhere in Europe, or Saskatraz bees, which is from Saskatchewan, and they might be interested in different genetics that some of these subspecies have to offer, and whether or not they're suited to the climate. So ultimately, we want to make sure that the bees that we are breeding is suited to our climate. That's why I like to focus on local. But you can try to find other subspecies that may or may not thrive in this climate, but it always takes some time to adjust.
That actually, touching on the climate thing, you did send me an article beforehand which had a stat that I found was very interesting, and it was about how native colonies versus managed colonies lose heat in a different way. So wild colonies have much thicker walls. Like if they're nesting in a typical tree cavity, their rate of heat loss is 4 to 7 times lower than a managed colony in a standard wooden hive. And that was really interesting to me, because it makes perfect sense, but it's not something I thought of. Like, don't the bees get cold in the winter? It's not something that really goes through my head. But I thought that was a pretty interesting little thing right there.
Yeah, there's lots of considerations that we want to make when we are trying to manage bees in a man-made environment. And what we want to try to look at is, how are the bees thriving in nature, and ultimately, what can we try to do to recreate this environment where they're thriving in nature, but as a beekeeper?
Another one I wanted to touch on that I thought was a little funny, but what's up with killer bees? Did we mess up? And where are all the stories about bee deaths? When I was a kid, that was on TV all the time. Maybe it was just a 90s thing, but on like Spike TV and National Geographic, there were all these dramatic videos about like, killer bees, the swarms are in Florida now, they're spreading throughout North America. And I, as a child, thought that by the time I was an adult, there would be killer bees in Alberta. Where did we go wrong? Was that a big whoopsie?
So I don't know much about killer bees. That just kind of drives home the importance of trying to support our native bees and not importing bees where they're not native, because we can see how either it's to the detriment of their health, or becomes unmanageable in terms of pests and disease, or in this case with killer bees, they become more of a threat to humans.
Yeah, the way I remember it, again from my decades-old memory of these stories, it sounded like the African honeybees were producing more honey but were more aggressive, and the European honeybees produced less honey but they were more docile. So some smart people thought, hey, if we breed them, then we'll get bees that are more docile and produce more honey, and instead they got bees that were more aggressive and produced less honey, which was the worst of both worlds. But yeah, I thought that was going to be a bigger deal. Killer bees, quicksand, all these things that are supposed to be everywhere that luckily aren't.
That's kind of reminiscent of Jurassic Park and where things can go wrong with human intervention.
Yeah, we don't always nail it. Sometimes we do well, not every time. I also was told by someone that I needed to watch a documentary about bee deaths and monocultures, something about issues with almond orchards specifically. Is that something you're familiar with?
So there is a difference between managing honeybees in an urban setting versus a monoculture setting where there's unfortunately usually very heavy pesticide use and there's a lot of the same crop. So this eventually can lead, and there's some crops that are dirtier than others or use more pesticides than others. So this can lead to colony collapse and to the detriment of the honeybee. In general, the honeybee has a lifespan of about 6 weeks. But according to the Western producers in different agricultural magazines, they talk about how the lifespan of the honeybee, because of some of these factors, is getting shorter and shorter. So it is interesting to pay attention to that. But the benefit of having bees in an urban setting, despite a lot of the concrete that we have, is that diversity of flora that we have in the city, which helps to promote more of a balanced diet for the bees and to promote a healthy gut bacteria.
In one of the articles you sent me, it talked about how managed colonies versus wild colonies might be a difference in the diversity of their food sources. So it says some managed colonies are placed in agricultural ecosystems, such as huge almond orchards or vast fields of oil seeds, where they experience low diversity pollen diets and poor nutrition. The effects of pollen diversity were studied by comparing nurse bees given diets with monofloral pollens or polyfloral pollens, and bees fed the polyfloral pollen lived longer than those fed the monofloral pollens. I know that there are issues with monoculture. I never really considered their impact on bees. I guess you could see some similar issues with people as well, though, when people only eat like one thing forever and then suddenly you're missing nutrients, like sailors getting scurvy because they didn't have any citrus fruits on board.
That's another reason, or that's another thing that we want to look at when we're considering what are we feeding our bees. Because when we're feeding our honeybees honey, and I say that because it sounds intuitive, but oftentimes in seasons of dearth in the spring and in the fall, often beekeepers may use pollen patties or sugar syrup. And so that really doesn't have the same pH that honey would, and can lead to dysentery as well with the bees.
Bees can get dysentery?
Dysentery.
Is it like the same thing you got in the Oregon Trail game?
So I'm not sure what that is. But honeybees, they're very hygienic. So over the winter, when they can't leave the hive because the temperatures are cooler, they usually won't poo in the hive. They wait until the temperatures are warmer and they can excrete any waste outside of the hive. But often if they don't have a good gut bacteria, then that can be the cause of dysentery, where you'll see a lot of bee poop on the front of the hive or even on the inside of the hive.
That's not good. And I just confirmed, it is the same thing. Bees can get. Did you ever play the Oregon Trail?
No.
It was a game. It was like an old computer game in the 90s, and the running joke was that no matter what you did, you were gonna die of dysentery because none of us were good at playing the game. But it's neither here nor there. Another fun one that was suggested to me is, can bees have regional accents with their dances and pheromones? Now, I know I've seen this with birds. Certain species of birds, they'll have like an East Coast accent and a West Coast accent. If you pay a lot of attention to ravens, you'll hear them, like the ravens on Vancouver Island sound very different than the ravens in Edmonton. They'll sound different than the ravens in the mountains. So do you have any insights on bee accents, or whether they wiggle their little bee butts differently in different parts of the country?
There's always research that is being done on honeybees and their language and their intelligence, to speak to their intelligence. One of our locations is McGrath Mansion with Concordia University, and we do have some researchers who are always looking for different areas to research. In terms of language and pheromone, there is common language and pheromone that the honeybees do use to communicate, whether it's to signal danger or whether it's to signal where to forage their food. Mm-hmm. So they'll do a waggle dance, and the intensity of the waggle will indicate the abundance of the food supply, and the distance that they move and the direction that they move on the frame will also indicate the distance or the direction away from the sun.
That is interesting. Yeah, I love it. I love seeing the little videos of bee dancing. It's, yeah, totally new language.
And they each have their own roles as well inside the hive. So at different stages of life, like you might hear the terms young nurse bees or worker bees. It's not a different bee. It's the same bee. It's just at a different stage in its life where it would have a different role. So there's different roles where they might be guarding the entrance from any robbers or predators, which can include wasp or even other honeybee colonies. Then the young nurse bees, right when they hatch, their role is to feed the young. And so on. And then later, the last stage in life is as a worker bee, they go out and forage. And sometimes, they might, the end of their life might, occur as they're out on their trip or in the hive, and then they get cleaned out by the undertaker bees.
Mm-hmm. Are there bees that have that role?
There are bees that do clean out the hive.
That is... that actually touches on another question. Who's going to win the battle between the bees and the wasps? Is there a battle, or is that just us looking for a battle? Is there a rivalry for pollen? Do they really care?
So that is something that we want to take into consideration as well when we're bringing in non-native species to somewhere where they might be interfering, let's say, or competing for resources. We might consider... okay, so I will talk about how wasps might, if we're in a season of dearth in spring or in fall, they are looking for resources and there's very few resources. So that's when a wasp, for example, might try to rob a hive, or other honeybee colonies might try to rob a hive. So what we need to try to do in those seasons is make sure that the size of the colony reflects the size of the hive, that the hive isn't too big for the colony. So as a beekeeper, we're providing them with this equipment. So if the hive is, let's say, 2 or 3 supers tall, but there's really only enough bees to fill out the frames in one super, then ultimately we'll want to try to remove the supers where the bees aren't able to cover the frames properly, because if a wasp or another honeybee comes in, they need to be able to drag it out, and then if they can't and they're not able to defend the entrance, then there is that process of robbing, which can result in casualties.
So a super is what again exactly?
So in a hive, it's comprised of supers. They're stacked, and each super, it's like a box, can for the hives that I use, are 8 frames wide, and they're medium frames. And you would, to do inspections, you'd be pulling out the frames. So that's what a super is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Are the Japanese giant hornets, you've probably seen the videos of the Japanese giant hornets getting into fights with the Japanese honeybees. Have you seen those where the Japanese bees will swarm the wasp and essentially cook it? Have you seen that?
I don't know much about that, but I have seen that even with honeybees. They might actually do that if, like, let's say they hatch a few queens, or they don't like their existing queen, they might actually ball around the queen to try to kill it, and doing the same thing by generating that temperature that would result in...
I didn't realize they did it here too. I saw, it was either BBC or National Geographic, they were talking about, like, the issues with the Japanese giant hornets back in Japan, and how their honeybees had evolved to just, swarm the hornet and cook it, essentially.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that the honeybees here did the same thing. I guess if they're all honeybees, they would all kind of have that built in almost.
Yeah, that is a behavior that they can do, right? To work together to try to manage any invaders or intruders in the hive, or even a queen that they don't like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's awesome. How often do beekeepers get stung, and how do they avoid it?
Honeybees are naturally very docile. There's different ways of managing our colonies. So if we go in and we're very gentle, so with our hives, we take our time, we don't use a smoker, and we make an effort to not squish a bee. When you do squish a bee, it can signal a stress pheromone that apparently smells like bananas, and then it signals to all the other bees that there's danger. So we are very gentle and very careful as we manipulate the frame, because we are also using the art of beekeeping as, an act of, or we use beekeeping as a way to how do you say, promote mindfulness. So in doing that, we're trying to tune into what's happening in the hive and the world around us, and just paying attention to what we're doing. So what was the question again?
Oh, just how do beekeepers avoid getting stung?
So a lot of beekeepers, and even myself, I'll continue to wear a suit. Although you don't have to wear a suit, but occasionally you might have a hive that's maybe more stressed. So in the past, one of our locations was at the Alberta Aviation Museum. And even though there's, a lot of flora, in the river valley only a few kilometers away, or in people's gardens, for example, there was construction nearby and a lot of concrete. So maybe there wasn't that heating and cooling effect that helps the bees stay a little cooler, or maybe it's the vibrations from the construction that can cause them to be on guard. And there could be different stressors. So if they have different stressors in their environment and they are more aggressive when we open up the hive, it gets the beekeeper to consider what is stressing them out and what can we do to mitigate that, because their goal definitely isn't to sting us. And I have managed the bees without a suit, but just for precautionary measures, I always just like to wear it, because it's happened to me a few times. It's not beautiful when you get stung, and there's always a few days for recovery.
I noticed you emphasized the whole not using a smoker thing. Is a smoker not good for bees?
I would just say that for us it's just not necessary. So we just try to use as little intervention as possible. And with the different locations that we have, it is time consuming to get the smoker started up, and then we move to our next location.
Okay.
So it's just a little process.
That makes sense. Do bees hibernate? What is their normal lifespan? I know you said 6 weeks, right? 6 weeks is a normal lifespan for the bees?
Approximately 6 weeks, yeah.
Do they hibernate through the winter? Or would only the queen hibernate through the winter?
So in order for a colony to survive, a queen cannot survive on her own, because they do form a cluster to keep or maintain a certain temperature in the hive. And the cluster does need to be strong enough going into winter in order for them to regulate the temperature in the hive. And like you talked about earlier, in the cavity of a tree, they're able to better regulate the temperature as opposed to a man-made hive. So there's different ways of overwintering the hive, and then going into fall, they do produce a very unique a set of bees called winter bees, and they are able to carry through the winter until spring, and then those bees are the ones that then go on to forage and bring food back into the hive before the queen starts to lay again and produce some new bees.
Do the winter bees live longer, or do they also have that 6-week life cycle?
They do live longer. They are able to live through the winter, and there are a few different considerations or reasons for that. Is one, they're not expending as much energy. They do slow down in the hive in the winter, and the colder that it gets, and they don't use as much food in the winter when it's colder. So the more warm spells that we have, the more food they burn through, and then there is the risk of starvation if they don't have enough food, or if we continue to have a lot of warm days through the winter.
Yeah, we've had quite a few recently. Another fun one. So for people that are allergic but want to help the bee population, how can they do so in a manner that doesn't risk their own health and risks getting stung? Would it just be plant a pollinator garden, or?
I think that's something that I think there's definitely more of a movement these days towards, I don't want to say going lawn free, because I still have a lawn myself, although I would, love for just more plants, more trees, more shrubs. But we can do more to make an effort to just plant more of a diversity of plants in our yard, so that there's always something in bloom from early spring until late season fall. There's not as many plants or food sources available for our pollinators or bees in early spring and in the late fall, so it definitely helps to take those into consideration. That's why the city of Edmonton has a no-mow May. And part of that's to encourage dandelions in the yard, because that is an important food source. Willows are also a very important food source early spring. But there's other things that we can keep in mind too. Is it necessary to spray our lawns? That can impact our pollinators adversely, because oftentimes when they're spraying, the weather isn't a factor that's taken into consideration. So if it does rain the same day or the next day after your lawn is sprayed, then the bees or pollinators are drinking runoff, and it is something that will lead to is to the detriment of the bees. So as a beekeeper, we want to have a clean water source. Sometimes people might find bees or pollinators around their pools, so it's good for the bees to be able to identify a clean water source so that they do stay hydrated. And there's a few other things that we consider to take care of our pollinators and so on.
Yeah. Two things. First off, have you ever read the book Naturescapes?
No.
It's by a local author, Myrna Pearman, and it's all about creating a natural garden specific to Alberta based on your eco-region. Here's how you make a good area for pollinators. Here's how you can attract more hummingbirds, bees, butterflies, all kinds of different birds. I really like it. Apparently there are some people that want to write their own version of Naturescapes or a slightly different version of Naturescapes, but I think that's a really good place to start. I can show you the book right after we're done recording because it's fantastic. And I lost the second question. It was about pollinating. It was about native bee stuff. Oh, there we go. Yes. So we recently went to Berlin, and in front of their nature museum, they had a pollinator garden, and it was actually set up specifically so that there would be something blooming every month, so that the bees would also, all the bees and the flies and everything would have a constant food source throughout the year. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're also interested in, having a yearly food source for the...
Monthly
food source for the bees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for good early and late bloomers?
So I'll just start by saying Germany is very ahead of its time. They're very wonderful when it comes to organic and nature, and you see in the grocery store is biological, everything's organic, so it's pretty neat. In terms of recommendations, we have a lot of really neat societies like Edmonton Native Plant Societies that can make some recommendations, because we do also encourage a lot of native plants. In terms of anything specific, I'm not a gardener. I'm really not a gardener, so I myself am learning, and I like to work with different companies that like to do more natural landscaping using some native plants. So even at some of our locations like Grierson, we've had Fescue come in and volunteer their time to help to share with us different ways that we can do add some more native plants to our landscaping, and how it will help to benefit our soil, because regenerative beekeeping doesn't start and stop with beekeeping. It really starts with the soil. So even if we're looking at regenerative farming, whether it's with cattle, well, the nutrients that are in the soil get passed down to us ultimately when we're eating or consuming the end product. And the same is even with honeybees. So everything starts kind of from the ground up, literally, and the more native plants and the deeper the root system, the more nutrients we have in the soil, the more life that we have in the soil, and this is definitely translates to a healthier ecosystem.
Yeah. So there were two more fun ones. First off, how long would it take a swarm of bees to kill a person?
So I was, that's a funny question, so we didn't leave that one out. But honeybees would not seek out to kill a person. Although if someone has an allergy, that's not something I'd be able to speak to specifically. So you wouldn't have a swarm of bees seeking out to harm somebody. And that's part of the education that we try to do within the city of Edmonton, is to educate people properly on beekeeping and to make people feel more comfortable around bees in general, so that we try to speak to the safety of it, and also to speak to really what is regenerative beekeeping, so that people can understand a better way, or look at more of a regenerative model to maintain healthy bees, so that we can continue with having bees in the city.
Take that, Hugo. And now for the final question. Why is there only a queen bee and not a king bee as well? Seems sexist. Are bees sexist, and if so, why?
Well, The queen is the one who's responsible for laying eggs in the hive, and the only way she can lay fertilized eggs is if there's male bees involved. And one queen in her lifetime mates with up to 20 drones. So there's 20 different drones. There's the genetics of 20 different drones that are reflected in one hive alone when we're looking at a queen mating in nature. Like, we're not talking about people that are breeding queens. I can't really speak to that process, but when a queen mates with a drone, that's the end of their life. So they mate and then they fall to their death and they die. But we're considering the lifespan of a honeybee in general, aside from the queen, is about 6 weeks long. So once the drone is mating, he's likely towards the end of his life anyways. So is there sexism in the hive? No. The female bees are the ones that are producing the honey. The drones aren't producing the honey. But it is interesting to note that when they're in a season of dearth, they will kick out the males because there's no need for them in the hive anymore. Then they're not looking to really mate, towards the end of the season, because the queens ought to be mated already, and that's not the time for breeding, because they need to be gearing up for producing winter bees. And the process of making a queen takes 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks for her to mate. So it's overall a 1 month process. And if you're doing that at, let's say, beginning or end of September, you're cutting it really close, because it's after a month that she would then be able to start laying eggs.
I don't think we were recording. I think this was before the episode we talked about this, but you also said that a lot of beehives don't actually have chambers big enough to grow a drone?
Yeah, so in commercial beekeeping, there's often frames with a plastic foundation in it that have a preset cell size to encourage the production of female bees only. And the reason for that is because female bees are the ones that produce honey. So as part of our management, we like to have frames without foundation. We call it foundationless frames. And the reason is so that the bees can ultimately choose the size of the cells according to the need in Edmonton area. So if the honeybee colony is noticing that there's not a lot of male bees in the surrounding area, and they feel that there's a need to kind of diversify the genetics, then they will build out more comb that's a little larger for the drones, because male bees' drones are larger than the female bees. And by the time they're able to cap the cells, so the stages of development are egg, larva, pupa, and then it's capped before it hatches, it will look more like corn pops, whereas the surface of the a capped brood for a female bee would be more flat.
Interesting. So for the commercial hives, though, wouldn't allowing a few drones give you a self-sustaining colony?
So if we're looking at building local genetics that aren't relying on miticides, you're right. Genetics play a very important role in genetic diversity and for the bees to be able to look after themselves without relying on miticides. But commercial hives do, or commercial operations, or even urban operations, because of Alberta being one of the largest producers of honey in North America, commercial procedures are often more commonly adopted in an urban setting. But oftentimes, for the sake of time is honey, they will just focus on rearing female bees, and if they lose a queen, they won't facilitate the process of allowing the colony to make their own queen. They'll just buy a queen for $50, insert it into the hive, and we're back to business as usual, because a period of queenlessness where a queen lays 3,000 eggs a day, and if you think of how many eggs that would be over the course of a month, you're looking at that many bees that are not producing honey. And in the average lifespan of a bee over 6 weeks, they will produce about a quarter teaspoon of honey. So time is honey when you're looking at beekeeping for a lot of people, but when you're focusing on managing smaller colonies and your goal is hygienic stock and good genetics, then it's good to allow the bees to produce drones as needed.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, Anessa with YEG Honeycomb, thank you very much.
Take care.